The forest was engulfed in darkness. The fog drifted over the ground as if it were liquid, indistinct, obscuring all details and leading them into the unknown. Each step on the wet ground was accompanied by a deafening crunch, as if nature itself was resisting their movement. Adam and Emily walked side by side like two lonely people forced to move in the dark, not knowing what lay ahead. The wind rustled in the branches of the trees, giving the illusion that there was something or someone watching around them. There were many old secrets in this forest, but right now the most important thing for them to do was to just keep moving forward. Adam staggered, barely keeping his balance, his steps becoming more and more uncertain. Emily could see his face changing, the way he tried to hide the pain but couldn't. His gait wasn't as determined as it usually was. It was like he was on the verge of giving up. The dark blood stains that were on his jeans and jacket told him that his wound hadn't healed, and despite his best efforts to hold on, his strength was running out. "You should have stayed where you were, Adam." Her voice sounded soft, but there was anxiety in it. She couldn't look at him without worry, but despite her words, she clutched his hand tightly, supporting him as if it was all she could do. There was no fear in her eyes, only determination to help. Adam moved silently, his face contorted with pain, but he wasn't going to give in. He was strong, he had always been strong. But now, he knew he wouldn't last without her help. "I couldn't leave you," he replied, his voice sounding hoarse, as if every word was weighing on him. He looked up at her and his eyes were full of determination, but they didn't have that usual confident light in them. That light that usually burned in his eyes when he was by her side, when they walked boldly through life, seemed to have gone out. In its place was only emptiness, and Emily felt a chill creep into her soul. She realized it wasn't just a wound, something much more, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't leave him here alone, in this forest, in this world full of unknowns. They had been through so much together, and now he needed her more than ever. "You don't understand, Emily." His words sounded like a sentence. "I couldn't leave you here. We'd both die." She felt her heart clench. It wasn't just a desire to help, it was something more, a desire to protect, even if she was risking everything herself. With each step, she felt his body grow heavier and his breathing more and more intermittent. She quickened her step, hoping she could support him at least a little longer. Through the thick fog, the faint rays of the setting sun shone into their eyes, trying to break through the dense clouds. Emily looked around but saw nothing but endless trees and the gray haze that enveloped the forest. At times she thought she could see movement in that mist, that someone or something was shadowing them in that shadow, but she drove those thoughts away, not letting fear take over her mind. They had to move forward now, regardless of what lurked in this gloom. She had only one chance in her hands. Adam. She couldn't let him down. Adam grew more and more infirm with each step. He could barely stay on his feet, but he didn't say a word, didn't complain as he always did. He was like that, willing to overcome anything to protect her, to help her, to be there for her. His shoulders were tense, as if he was holding back an invisible storm ready to tear him apart from the inside. "You know we can't stop." Her words weren't a request, they sounded like an order, and she didn't even realize how it happened. Somehow, in that moment, she felt more determined than ever, as if it wasn't Adam who was her defense, but she was his. It was a strange feeling, but it gave her strength. He looked up at her, his eyes full of pain. But in them she could read gratitude and tenderness and all the things she couldn't put into words. She knew he wouldn't tell her that he cared about her, wouldn't tell her that he was afraid, but she saw it all in his gaze. Adam was the kind of man who never showed weakness, and maybe that was why she felt the weight of what was happening. I can't go any further." His voice was barely audible now, as if each breath was given to him with effort. He stopped, and Emily felt his hand slip from her shoulder. He was exhausted, and all his efforts to contain himself had finally worn off. Emily shuddered. Her heart seemed to stop for a moment, and she was ready to scream, to beg him. But then her gaze fell on his wound. He was badly wounded, and it was impossible to keep moving. The fog was thickening, and the forest seemed alive, ready to swallow them both. Emily took a step back, feeling her body resist this moment. "We can't go on." Her voice shook with emotion. "I won't leave you. It's not like you can't just fall, Adam." But he only gritted his teeth and, without another word, made his decision. There was no doubt in his eyes. He was willing to do anything for her. Adam straightened up, his movements more determined, but he couldn't hide the pain. There was something more than determination in his eyes now. It was a heaviness, a realization of the inevitability of what was happening. He knew there was no point in continuing to walk. He could die here in this forest, but more importantly, she had to survive. He could feel her anxiety, and he wished he could free her from that pain, but he couldn't. This sacrifice was his own choice. Emily stood beside him, not realizing what was happening. Every step she took was filled with despair. She couldn't afford to lose him. But as his gaze grew even harder, his silence became too loud to ignore. "We can't go on like this." His words sounded restrained, as if each word was difficult for him to say. His gaze was tired, but there was fire in it. The same fire that burned in his soul, even if his body was on the verge of collapsing. Emily felt her chest tighten. There was truth in his words, but she didn't want to accept it. How could she accept that their journey was so close to ending? How could she let him go when they had just begun? She wasn't ready to say goodbye. Not now. Not in this moment. "Adam, no, you can't." Her voice shook with desperation. She took a step toward him, and her fingers touching his arm was like lightning surging through her body. But he withdrew her hand, and his face grew even harder. She couldn't believe it was over so quickly. "Emily." His voice was cold, but there was deep pain in it. "You have to go alone. You have to live." Every word he said was like a blow to her heart, and she froze, disbelieving. He was her support, her protection. He was the man with whom she had gone through every fear, trial, and suffering. And now he was demanding that she let him go to save herself. "No, I won't leave you." Her voice was determined, but inside her, everything was crumbling. She couldn't understand how he could be so sure of his decision. She couldn't understand how he could say, "Goodbye." So easily, he was willing to die to save her, and it tore at her soul. "You don't understand." His gaze became so piercing she felt her own heart lose strength. "You will survive. You have to. I can't let you die here." She couldn't accept that. How could they live if they were everything to each other? They had been through so much together, and now that their dream of salvation was so close, he was asking her to leave him behind. But despite her inner struggle, she felt she could not refuse him. He had made up his mind, and she couldn't change his choice. "You can't just leave me behind, can you?" Her voice shook as she tried to approach him again, but he looked away. His face was tense, and there was something in that tension that she couldn't understand. He didn't just want to leave, he had to. Emily stood, feeling her heart crumble to pieces. His words were like a final blow she couldn't bear to endure. All she wanted was to move on with him, to walk this path together despite all the obstacles. But he was right. She had to live, and if she didn't agree, if she didn't move on, her life would have no meaning. He was willing to sacrifice himself so she could see the light at the end of the tunnel. "Please." Her voice grew quieter, as if she was talking into herself. "You can't just walk away." But he was already ready to leave. He knew her life was the only thing he could save. He was leaving her, but not because he didn't love her. On the contrary, he loved her so much that he was willing to give up his life for her, and there was more to it than just a desire to survive. It was something that could not be understood in words. It was a farewell that would forever remain in their hearts. He stepped away from her, and even though she tried to follow him, her legs seemed too heavy. He turned but didn't stop. He already knew his decision was final. It wasn't just goodbye. It was more than that. It was a last chance for her. He was ready to leave her, knowing that she would live and he would stay here in this gloomy forest. "Adam!" she screamed, but his figure disappeared into the mist. He vanished as if he had never existed. Emily was left standing, clutching his personal item in her hands, the very chain he had worn all this time. She couldn't understand how it had happened, how he could disappear so quickly. But when her eyes met that object, she felt tears begin to roll down her cheeks. This was goodbye. It was a moment where she was losing him, but she also knew she had to move on. He said she had to live. He said she had to get through this, and she couldn't disobey. The fog thickened around her, but she couldn't let herself go back. Every step into this darkness was a step toward a new beginning. A new world awaited, and she knew she had to move forward, even if her heart was torn apart. This forest, this fog, it was more real than anything she had seen in her entire life. And yet, despite this heavy, restless feeling, she kept going. Why? Why? She couldn't find an answer. Each step she took seemed more futile, but still she went forward. It was a strange feeling, walking in a state of mind like you're just walking, but you don't know where you're going. You don't know why. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was desperation, but she couldn't stop, couldn't believe that this path wasn't just part of her destiny. When she stopped to catch her breath, her gaze fell to the ground again. It was a strange sensation to see each step leave a trail in that foggy dirt, but that trail was gone, as if it had never been there, as if she was stepping through a world that never existed. Emily brought her hand up to her face, feeling the raindrops that began to fall from the sky, the fog getting even thicker. With each droplet falling, she felt her body growing heavier and heavier. But even at this moment, despite all the dangers, the fear that encompassed her could not disappear. Suddenly, she felt movement nearby, a rustle, quiet as if someone or something was moving in her direction. At first, Emily thought it was her imagination, but then, after a moment, the sound repeated itself. She froze, unable to realize where it was coming from. The wind had increased, and now every rustle of the branches, every movement of the leaves was like a portent. The fog around her grew thicker, and all she could see were the distant silhouettes of trees and a dim glow breaking through the clouds. She turned her head, gazing into the void, trying to make out details. With every glance she took, with every step, the sense of danger became more and more real. Everything in her body screamed to run, but she couldn't. She stood as if in a daze. At that moment, a shadow flashed between the trees, something large, vague, moving with some unnatural speed, and she didn't even have time to take a step before she felt her heart stop in her chest. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a distinct realization. The existence of something that with every move it made raised before her only one thing, a premonition of imminent danger. Emily couldn't believe her eyes, but the shadow was there. It was moving with incredible speed, seeming to pop out of the mist itself. It wasn't something ordinary, something that could be understood. The creature she saw was strange and unfamiliar. Its shape was almost indistinct, as if the shadow itself didn't want to be caught. At first she thought it might be part of a branch, but then it moved again, and her intuition told her that it was something alive. But what? Her steps were quick, restrained, as if she was trying to get away from something she couldn't understand. But she knew there was no escaping it. The creature showed itself again. It moved quickly, confidently, as if it had been following her for a long time. This unknown force that had surrounded her now made her heart beat at an accelerated rhythm. The shadow, elusive, unnatural, was coming closer. Emily backed away, her gaze darting us around, looking for a way through. But it was too late. The creature seemed to already be right in front of her, her inner fear reaching its peak. She clenched the knife in her hands, but knew it wouldn't help. The creature was close, and all she could do was stand there and watch it approach. It was not an attack. The creature showed no aggression. Its movement was smooth, silent. It moved with the same silent majesty as the mist. There was no haste in its movements. It lifted one paw, another, and its breath caught, as if it wasn't just walking toward her, but was about to study her, to understand her. There was no fear in its gaze, no desire to destroy. It was something that was trying to learn, something that was trying to understand. And so, when it finally approached, Emily felt her body clench from that contact. What was she supposed to do? Why did she feel that this moment was crucial? The creature stood before her, and everything around her froze. Only the fog continued to thicken. She couldn't look away, couldn't realize what it was. Emily stood as if paralyzed, her body clenched in a cold iron grip, as if it couldn't move. The creature in front of her stood motionless, and her instincts screamed at her to run away, but she couldn't take her eyes off its eyes. With each passing moment, she felt the fog enveloping her even more tightly, consuming her not only externally, but internally as well. The creature's gaze was cold, almost blank. It was not evil. There was no rage, and yet there was a depth in its eyes that a mere animal did not have. It felt not so much a threat as a strange emptiness, as if this creature had no purpose, but was searching for it nonetheless. And in that search, it was ruthless. Emily felt her heart clench with fear, but at the same time, couldn't help but feel some strange connection to this creature. It was not something she expected to encounter in this forest. It was something more mysterious, something that raised 1,000 questions but no answers. Each of her breaths grew heavier and heavier, and the closer it came, the harder it was to keep from panicking. "What do you want?" Her voice was barely audible, as if she herself couldn't believe the words she had spoken. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she couldn't contain her fear. The creature did not answer. It stood there, its eyes steady on her, but it didn't seem to understand her words. Suddenly, she realized that the creature could not understand her at all, that it was so alien, so unlike anything she knew, that even the language they spoke was foreign to the creature. Nevertheless, it took another step forward, not quickly, not aggressively, but surely. Emily felt her breath catch. She couldn't back away, couldn't move as if there was no turning back. The creature still showed no hostility, but everything in her body screamed that it wasn't just watching her, but testing her reactions. And that's when her intuition pushed her to a decision. She slowly lowered the knife she clutched in her hands, feeling its blade become cold and insignificant in her fingers. This was something more than a threat. It was a challenge. Emily didn't know exactly what she had to do, but she sensed that something inside her would change, that her decision in this moment would determine what came next. The creature stopped in front of her, and, as if not noticing her indecision, it tilted its head slightly, still watching her with its dark eyes. Emily felt a strange sensation that it was waiting for something, that she had to take some important step before it would let her move on. She took a slow step forward, not knowing what she was looking for, not knowing why she was doing this. She couldn't believe she was standing in front of this creature, and yet her steps moved. She felt determination fill her chest. The creature, unmoving, watched her every move. I don't know what you want." Her voice was quiet again, but there was indecision, doubt in it. She felt strange, as if she had to do something that couldn't be explained in words. And then her hand came up again, but now it was not holding the knife. She instinctively reached forward, as if that was the only way to find a connection with this creature. Suddenly, quite unexpectedly, the creature raised its hand. It didn't move abruptly. It didn't hurry. But there was something invisible about the movement that made her freeze. It was like a muffled gesture, like a request, but a request she couldn't understand. The creature raised its hand and Emily froze. Every nerve in her body, every cell in her body tensed like taut strings. She couldn't understand what it meant. The creature didn't move, didn't speak. It only stood before her, but its every gesture seemed meaningful. Its every shadow in the fog became a particle of something larger she couldn't understand. Her thoughts were floundering. She didn't know what to do. The creature showed no aggression, but her intuition told her that it would decide her fate after all. Emily couldn't contain her anxiety. There was no fear in its eyes. This creature was different, not what she was used to. It was foreign. It was old, ancient, and her spirit, her soul was beginning to realize this wasn't just a chance encounter. This was something important, something she could not have predicted. The creature continued to stand, its dark eyes reflecting her like mirrors, and Emily felt her own face reflected in their depths, full of fear and bewilderment. She couldn't understand what she should do. Why had she ended up here? Why was her life tied to this creature? The fog around her grew thicker and thicker, and the feeling that she was walking into a trap became more and more apparent. She tried to find the strength to do something to keep from falling into the trap, but her mind was at a loss. The creature didn't speak, but it was clearly expecting something, and Emily realized if she didn't take that step, she wouldn't be able to continue. This moment would decide her fate. The creature took a step forward. Its movement wasn't sudden, but it was so swift that Emily didn't have time to react. It stepped closer, and her instincts called out for her to fight. But she knew that her choice now was to believe in this creature, a creature that was waiting for her move, her decision. The fog slowly began to dissipate, but Emily could still feel its dense cloud around her. The forest that had been bright and vibrant before was now dark and empty, as if space and time had simultaneously slowed down. Emily stood still, unsure of where to go, but her heart told her that now she must move on. An entire century seemed to have passed in the past few days, and all that was left was a choice. But where to move on to next? Her thoughts were vague, but something lingering in her soul told her that there was something important ahead, that some purpose awaited her that would connect her to this forest, to this path. She couldn't explain what it was, but the feeling was strong, like a light she couldn't see but could feel. The forest was almost lifeless. Even the air itself seemed to have grown heavy. Emily looked deep into the forest, her gaze meeting nothing but the deafening darkness that hid all the secrets of this place. All she felt was as if her own footsteps were becoming less and less significant in this vast space. But despite this, her body wouldn't let her stop. She kept walking as if at some distant point her journey would end, as if her existence mattered despite the fact that there was nothing living around her. With each step, with each movement of her foot, she felt the world around her change more and more. The noise that had been heard in the misty forest before was now gone. In that moment, everything became strangely quiet. She couldn't tell if it was natural or if the forest was becoming part of what she felt inside. But despite this silence, she continued to move forward, feeling as if something invisible was pulling her towards it. But at that moment, something in the distance caught her attention. The dark outline of something unusual. It looked like an old tree, only much bigger. Emily felt her heart skip a beat. There was something about this place that reminded her of ancient tales, some ghost of her memories that seemed familiar but still indistinct. With each step she took, she drew closer to that huge tree. There was nothing but emptiness in its shadows. But Emily felt this was where she was supposed to be. This place beckoned to her like an unknown force she couldn't resist. As if sensing her approach, the tree began to change. Its moss-covered trunk grew lighter, and strange patterns began to appear in its bark. They glowed with a dim but warm light. creating an atmosphere around her that was hard to call real. Emily stopped for a moment, gazing into that tree, and her heart began to beat faster. It felt like this moment, this choice, wasn't just a coincidence. She wasn't here by chance. It was something more than that. She took a step forward, and in that moment, the light around the tree grew brighter. The tree seemed to respond to her presence, its light growing brighter, and despite all the darkness around her, Emily felt the world grow warmer and her steps more confident. But before she could approach that tree, a new figure appeared before her eyes, a shadow that stretched out from the earth itself, as if the earth itself had given birth to it. Emily froze. Her eyes widened, and she felt everything inside her shrink. The figure in front of her stood motionless, like a shadow dissolving into the forest. Emily could only make out the outline, a silhouette that seemed to be part of the forest itself. It was a creature, but it didn't move. It was like a shadow, like a ghost, stretched out in this light that came from the tree. The creature wasn't evil, but Emily sensed that it wasn't just a part of this forest. It was something deeper than just a passerby in this world. It was looking at her. She couldn't figure out what this creature was, but there was something strange in its eyes, something that didn't fit her concept of the world. It wasn't a creature, not just a guardian of the forest, but something ancient, unknown. Emily felt her body clench with an inner terror, and at the same time, a strange curiosity. The creature didn't move. It stood, and her gaze met its eyes. Emily tried to comprehend what she was seeing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes were penetrating her, probing her soul, her every fear, her every weakness. It was as if it already knew her, as if it was an integral part of her own destiny. There were no sounds, only the silence that pierced the forest. Emily felt her breath begin to hitch, the air growing cold, her heart clenching in her chest. "Who are you?" Her voice was barely audible, her words blending into the fog. The figure did not answer, but there was something in its movement that made her realize the creature wasn't just listening to her words, it was listening to her soul. Emily felt her gaze growing harder and harder, as if each glance from this creature was getting closer to some important truth. She took a step forward, but the creature did not move. The silence consumed everything, and in that moment, Emily realized that her path, her struggle, her future depended on what she did now. It wasn't just a choice, it was a test of her own strength. Emily stood, unable to look away. The creature in front of her didn't move, and her inner restlessness was beginning to grow into some unspeakable anxiety. The creature's gaze was penetrating, as if it were not just looking at her, but penetrating her very essence. With each passing moment, Emily felt her strength gradually waning. Her mind was a mixture of fear and curiosity, anxiety and a strange calmness. She couldn't understand why it wasn't attacking, why it wasn't doing anything to complete this ordeal. There was no aggression in its eyes, but there was something about it that made her feel as if her own fate depended on that look. She took a step forward, and at that moment the creature raised its head slightly. The light coming from the tree grew brighter, illuminating its figure. Emily could now make out its outline. Its body was dark, but its eyes glowed as if they reflected all the darkness she had ever seen. The creature didn't look quite material, but rather like a blob of shadows and light merging into one. "You came here for a reason." His voice was low and sounded like an echo in her soul. Emily froze, not believing her ears. The creature was speaking her language, but it wasn't just words. It was something that penetrated her heart. "You cannot walk this path alone," it continued, its voice filled with the same coldness and depth as its gaze. Emily felt her heart skip a few beats. Those words sounded like a sentence, a message she couldn't ignore. Immediately, it felt like the creature knew everything about her journey, all her losses and fears. It was part of this world, part of her destiny, and her purpose Her choices were connected to it. But how? Why should she walk this path with him? The creature gave no answer, but her inner voice said she had to go. She took a step forward but froze for a moment. The creature didn't move, and only its eyes continued to look at her with the same expression. She realized that it was waiting for her to make the decisive move. She knew that on this path, at this crossroads, her choices would determine her future. What do I have to do? Her voice sounded weak, but there was more to it than just a question. It was a request, silent and sincere, because she didn't know what was next. She had walked through this forest with the thought of surviving, but now her journey had become something deeper. She was searching for answers to questions that could not be solved by movement alone. The creature raised his hand, and the gesture was both an order and a suggestion. He said nothing more, but his gaze was so full of meaning that Emily realized she must go where he was leading her. She had to trust this path, this being, if she wanted to find what she was looking for. She could feel the sky above her changing now. The light she saw became brighter, and the forest around her became more alive. It felt strange, as if she wasn't just surrounded by trees and mist, but something more, an unknown force creating a path in front of her. The creature stepped aside a little, allowing her to walk forward, and Emily, despite her fear and doubt, took that step. Emily moved forward, feeling her steps become sure and the air around her fill with a kind of power. The fog that had seemed so dense not long ago was now becoming more and more transparent, and she could make out the details of the forest. Its trees now seemed to her not just a part of nature, but an important part of the path, a part of her destiny. Everything around her was coming to life. The leaves on the trees began to rustle as if they were having some invisible conversation with her, and the light from the giant tree grew brighter and brighter. Emily felt her fear fading away and her body filling with new strength. Perhaps it was the creature, perhaps it was this forest, but she felt that her journey was not over. It was only the beginning. Every step she took was now full of confidence, and though everything around her continued to seem unusual and strange, she felt no more fear. The forest that had once been dark and lifeless was now alive, its atmosphere filled with light, and the mist that had been her enemy was now her ally. She didn't realize what had changed, but the feeling was strong. It seemed her choice was the right one. Suddenly, a light appeared in front of her. It was a light coming not from the stars, not from the moon, but from the earth itself. Emily stepped closer, her steps becoming even more confident. The light grew brighter, and she saw before her a huge moss-covered rock with ancient writing carved into its surface. These symbols were unfamiliar to her, but they felt like a part of her path, a sign she had to understand. The creature stood nearby, watching her. It didn't move, but its footsteps spoke for themselves. Emily stepped closer and held out her hand, feeling her breathing become more even. It was the moment she realized that this path was no accident. These ancient writings, this light, this rock, it was all part of her destiny. She had to go through it to realize what was at the other end of this path. The mist was no longer what it had seemed at first. It had become light, transparent, like milk that doesn't hide the world but reveals it. Emily walked through the fog, feeling the air grow warmer with every movement she made. The forest around her was no longer just a place. It was a living, breathing entity that became more familiar, more real with each step she took. Her steps were becoming sure. She couldn't tell what exactly had changed, but every breath she took was now full of fresh air, as if she were taking a step toward her past, but not into the familiar world, but into a world that was hidden behind a veil of oblivion. Everything was not as it had been before, and every moment, every glance was like a newfound experience. She knew that this place was no accident. It was a place she had to pass through. The light coming from the ancient rock she had seen earlier was much brighter now. Emily felt her body react to this light, not physically but spiritually. It was like an awakening, like the resurrection of some forgotten feeling. The creature that followed her moved as if it were part of this world, part of this energy. It was not what she perceived as a threat. It was an unknown guardian that would guide her to the place where her path would meet with what she needed to understand. And so, at last, she approached the gate. This gate was not like an ordinary gate. They were stone pillars covered in ancient runes and symbols that seemed so old that their language was not for this time. Every line, every curl, every outline was a sign, but at the same time it was new, like something forgotten and newfound. Emily stood before this gate, not knowing what to do. She felt her soul shrinking from this moment. This was the moment of truth. Was she ready? Or was she just part of some big game she couldn't understand? It was like standing on the edge of a precipice, not knowing if there was a path or emptiness on the other side of the earth. The shadow of the creature that followed her began to dissolve into thin air. Its eyes, cold and penetrating, were still there, but they didn't seem threatening to her now. Emily felt her fear fading away, leaving room for something more. With each passing moment, she felt her own existence becoming a part of this world. She was connected to it, like particles of wind coming together in a single stream. The creature took a step forward and stopped beside her. It didn't speak, it didn't move, but there was something in its gaze that spoke volumes. It was not just a guardian of this world, but part of the truth itself, part of her own destiny. In that moment, Emily realized that her path was important, not just to her, but to everything she had to understand about this place. "You're ready?" His words sounded like a reminder, like a quiet voice that resounded in her soul. Emily inhaled deeply, but her body felt light. She could feel the fog becoming more and more transparent, as if reality itself was beginning to dissipate, leaving behind only pure truth. The gate in front of her was not just a symbol, but a true passageway into something she needed to understand. She stepped closer, her hands trembling, and she clenched them into fists as if she were trying to hide her anxiety that way. But there was something inside her that told her, "Go." It wasn't just a desire, it was a feeling that was born inside her heart, urging her forward. The creature standing nearby watched her. There was no threat or malice in its eyes. They were full of understanding. He knew that she must pass through this gate, and perhaps he was the guide that led her. Emily could feel this moment becoming pivotal for her. She could not deviate. This was not just a decision, but a fateful step, and her life depended on it. She took another step, and at that moment, the light coming from the gate became so bright that her eyes could not immediately perceive it. She shut her eyes, and when she opened them again, a completely different space opened before her. The gate wasn't just a passageway, they were a door to a world that existed beyond time, beyond her comprehension. It was a place where answers could possibly be found. But to understand, she needed to cross that threshold. The creature didn't move, but it stood nearby as if to confirm her choice. Emily could feel its presence as a quiet but inescapable force. She was no longer afraid. Her spirit was now strong and her thoughts clear. She knew she had to go through this gate, no matter what awaited her at the other end. She stepped through the threshold, and the space around her changed. The fog disappeared, and a new world opened before her. It was completely different. The light was dim, but it was everywhere, and everything around her looked like an unknown, mysterious world that existed apart from everything she knew. The forest was gone, giving way to a new world full of uncharted territory and unexpected twists and turns. Emily couldn't believe her eyes. This was a place where every step she took became part of this new world, where her actions mattered. There was no fog around her, no darkness, just light and emptiness like the promise of something more. She knew that her journey was no accident. Everything she had experienced had brought her here, and she had to realize what awaited her now. Emily took a step into a new world, and this world was completely different. Everything around her was full of light, but not the kind that came from the sun. It was soft, like a blanket that wrapped around every detail of this world, filling its atmosphere with a special, almost elusive warmth. The leaves on the trees, as if by themselves, began to sparkle, every particle of space reflecting the light, but not blinding. It was a calmness that seemed to be the nature of this place. In front of Emily was a forest, but it was unusual, as if it wasn't part of her world. The trees were gigantic, with branches that reached for the sky and leaves that glowed with a dim but soft light. Under her fingernails, she felt the strange softness of the soil that left no trace. This world was alive, but it was also not alive, as if everything in it existed in a state of perpetual waiting. The creature that had followed her was now standing nearby, but it did not move. Emily felt her breathing become even, and a sense of some resting power that was unmatched grew within her. The creature wasn't trying to explain anything to her. It was part of this world, and she knew that only she could figure out what needed to be done next. She looked around. Everything in this world seemed both familiar and foreign at the same time. This light, this calmness, it was all connected to her spirit. But what did it mean? Emily realized that she hadn't come here by accident. This place was what she was looking for. There was a feeling in her soul that her journey had not ended. This was where her journey was just beginning. But something about this place felt foreign, unnatural. That light that surrounded her wasn't warmth. It was something else, like an invisible barrier between this world and her reality. Emily felt a heavy weight encompass her heart. She had to figure out what she should do next. But what did it all mean? Why was she here? The creature standing next to her raised a hand, and Emily felt the air around her change. The slight movement, almost imperceptible, made the space around her transform. The light began to dim, the trees began to lose their brightness, and the atmosphere around her shrank. The creature didn't move, but Emily felt the moment become decisive. She took a step forward, and in that moment everything around her fell silent. The forest, which had seemed alive, was now unnaturally still. Emily felt something click inside her. She couldn't tell exactly what it was, but her intuition told her, now she must understand. There were no obvious roads or paths in this place, and all Emily could see was a new, mysterious world. This place didn't fit any of the types she knew. Everything was changed, and every step she took led her into an unknown reality. But Emily felt that her steps were her choice, her destiny. The forest grew denser and denser, and her path was dotted with unknown twists and turns. She couldn't tell where she was going, but her steps were sure. And despite all this uncertainty, she knew, only here, in this place, could she find answers. The creature beside her wasn't trying to guide her. It was waiting. It was part of her journey, and her journey was just beginning. Emily kept walking. The forest grew thicker and thicker, and her breath seemed to merge with every step, every movement of her body. She couldn't predict what would happen next. All she had to do was keep walking, not stopping, not asking questions. The feeling of confidence was growing, but at the same time there was a strange tension inside her. This world was becoming more and more foreign. The ground beneath her feet was soft but not real. The leaves that fell from the trees didn't rustle as they usually did, but simply dissolved into the air as if they didn't exist. Emily clenched her fists. What was she looking for in this place? Where was she? All she knew was that she had to keep walking. Suddenly, among the trees, a light appeared. It wasn't the light she had seen before, but a different light. A light that was the source of something important. Emily slowed her step, her gaze fixed on the spot where the light was brighter. She knew it wasn't just a random occurrence, but a sign. This was the moment when her path was going to lead her to something great. But what was it? She stepped closer, and her eyes filled with wonder. There, in front of her, was a stone. This stone was no ordinary stone. It was decorated with the same runes as the ones she had seen on the rock earlier. Those runes glowed with a faint but bright light, and Emily felt her heart begin to beat faster. She knew this wasn't just a random coincidence. It was connected to her path. Everything around her became quiet. The forest fell silent, and Emily felt the space around her shrink and the air become even more tense. The creature stood behind her, but now its presence felt not like a threat, but something that supported her. She had to step forward. She reached out to the stone and touched its surface. Instantly, as if the earth itself responded to her touch, the light began to grow, growing brighter and brighter. The stone began to glow, and Emily felt her body fill with something invisible. It wasn't just a sensation. It was the knowledge that her path was now part of something bigger. The creature behind her did not interfere. It was close by, but now Emily realized she was ready. She was ready for the next step. The light emanating from the stone grew brighter with each passing moment, and Emily felt her soul fill with something new. It was as if the whole world had suddenly opened its secrets to her, as if all her doubts and fears had vanished into the light. She couldn't take her eyes off the stone. Its light was not just bright. It was warm, like the rays of the sun passing through the morning mist. This light wasn't external. It was inside her. It touched her heart, her soul, and she knew this moment would change everything. Emily stepped closer, her hand still on the stone. There was no feeling of heaviness in her fingers. Instead, it was like touching something alive, unknown but real. The stone beneath her hand vibrated as if it were responding to her presence. The sensation was so strong that she felt the very ground beneath her feet begin to move. A new space opened up before her. A world she had thought was uncharted was now a part of her. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew that her footsteps had brought her here, to this light, to this stone. And now, as she touched it, she could feel her life becoming part of something great. The creature behind her did not interfere. It was motionless, as if it were waiting for Emily to make her own path, her own choice. Emily felt her heart fill with determination. This moment was hers, and she realized that she had to make it, to walk this path. The stone in front of her was the key that would open the door to the next challenge, to the next understanding of her world. The light around her grew brighter, and suddenly she felt the space around her begin to change. Slowly at first, and then with increasing force. The forest that was nearby became blurred, its outlines disappeared, and in their place, new shapes, new silhouettes appeared. They were vague and indistinct, but they did not frighten her. On the contrary, they beckoned. This new world that was unfolding before her was part of her journey. This was her chance. Emily took another step forward. The light from the stone was no longer just a source. It was now a guide. There were no questions in her mind. She knew she had to move forward, and her steps grew more and more confident. This wasn't just a test. This was a transformation. She could feel her body fill with power and her soul grow lighter. Everything that was happening was part of her journey, her great purpose. Suddenly, as if in response to her move, the creature moved. It approached her and stood beside her, as if giving her space to choose, to decide. It did not speak, but her gaze met its eyes, and in that gaze, she saw something more. This wasn't just a test. This was a release. All that she had endured, all that she had suffered, was now revealed as the beginning of a new path. Emily felt her body fill with calm. The creature was not her enemy. It was her friend, her guide. She was ready to move forward. With each step, Emily felt the space around her become more real as she sank into a new dimension. The forest that had been in her mind a moment ago was gone, dissolved in this new light, and now a whole new reality opened up before her. This place was not just a world, it was a reality that existed before she came here. Emily felt her life intertwined with this world, her footsteps becoming part of its structure. The creature moved behind her, but it didn't interfere. It was near, but at the same time, it was part of this new world. Its eyes still watched her, but now they weren't full of fear, they weren't full of threat. They were full of understanding. The creature knew that her journey was not just an accident, that she had to get through this moment, and she had. The world she entered was murky, but not threatening. It was strange and yet familiar at the same time. A light illuminated everything around her, and each step she took brought her closer and closer to answers. What was at the other end of this path? She didn't know, but she did know that her steps were the right ones. This was her place, her path. She felt her soul fill with something new. It wasn't just peace, it was knowledge. The knowledge she had been searching for. She didn't understand how, but this world was now a part of her. She wasn't just a traveler, she was a part of it. And everything she had experienced up to this point was part of her preparation. She was ready. Images began to appear before her. They were like visions, like echoes of the past, but they were not frightening. On the contrary, they were calm, clear. In these images, she saw herself. She saw herself walking through that forest, the pain and fear she had experienced. But now all of that was behind her. Now she was ready to accept what she really was. The creature didn't move, but Emily could feel it approving her steps. It was the one who had guided her on this path, the one who had been there for her, but had not interfered. She was ready. She knew she was. The tears wouldn't stop flowing, but she couldn't allow herself to be weak. She had to survive, and for him, for his sake. He stopped and looked at her, his eyes hard as stone, but there was still a trace of pain in them. Emily felt her heart clench in her chest. This was something. Emily kept moving forward, but now her steps were much more confident than before. She could feel the space around her changing with every movement she made, the air becoming lighter and the light brighter. In that moment, as if the earth itself responded to her presence, she saw that the light that had once seemed foreign to her was now becoming her friend, her ally. The forest she was stepping into was no longer just nature, but something deeper, more ancient than she had ever imagined. Her thoughts were no longer blocked by fear or doubt. Everything that was happening now was part of something big, something she couldn't fully understand but felt with all her soul. She was here, in this place, because she was ready to walk this path, to go through all the trials that fate was preparing for her. She approached the invisible boundary, and suddenly her gaze went to the center of this new world. There, in its center, stood a giant stone arch covered with ancient runes, glowing with a soft light, as if the sky itself had decided to give her this moment. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a gate she had to pass through to become part of this reality, to realize what she must do with the knowledge she had gained. The creature that followed her didn't try to stop her. It stood by her side. There was no fear or worry in its gaze. It was here to help her find her way, and she knew that now, as she approached this gate, her decision would be final. She was ready, and this moment was hers. Emily took the last step, and as her foot touched the ground, as if reality itself had responded, the gate in front of her began to slowly open. The fog around her disappeared, giving way to the light that illuminated her path. The gate she had been searching for so long was now her beginning, her new home. The creature stepped toward her, its shadow seeming huge yet light, dissolved into the light, and Emily realized that her journey was complete. Everything she had experienced, everything she had felt, had been part of her great journey. and now she was ready to move on. She stepped through the gate and found herself in a whole new place. The world she entered was unlike anything she had ever known. It was both familiar and foreign at the same time. It was a space that encapsulated eternity, a space that encapsulated her. She felt her soul fill with light, her heart begin to beat in unison with this world. Emily didn't know what lay ahead of her, but she was ready. She knew that her journey here was just beginning, and despite everything she had been through, she had no doubt. She had made the right choice. She was ready to start her new life, to be a part of this world. And as if reality itself adjusted to her steps, Emily felt her soul and this world merge into one. She was no longer alone. She had become part of something bigger, something eternal. Emily stood looking around, feeling the air around her fill with light and warmth. This world she had entered was full of mystery, but now she wasn't afraid. She wasn't looking for answers to the questions she had before. She knew that the answers would come with time, that her journey would continue, but now she would not seek what she did not understand. She would go forward into this new world with confidence and determination. Her steps became lighter, more confident. She moved forward, oblivious to what she left behind, this forest, this light, this creature. It was all her past. Now she was here, in this new place, and everything she was looking for was already inside her. The journey had been long, but now she was ready to continue it. The creature that had been her guide had disappeared into the misty distance, but Emily didn't feel the loss. She realized that this was not goodbye. It was part of her journey, and her journey was her own now. She walked without looking back, her soul filling with light and her heart growing more confident with each step. And so she continued to walk step by step into this new world, knowing that she was now part of the journey. There was a sense of completion in her heart, but also a sense of anticipation, because she knew this was only the first step. Her journey was just beginning, and there was an unknown but now clear goal ahead of her. The fog was fading. The light was dissipating, and the world was becoming clear and full of hope. She was walking, and perhaps she was no longer searching for answers. She had become a part of it all. The end. Things she hadn't expected. He had always been her protection, her support, her light in this dark world. And now, when she needed him most, he was pulling away. It was like a blow she couldn't recover from. Adam. Her voice was barely audible, but she couldn't stop. She walked towards him, her steps quick and determined, and yet she could feel his words tearing at her soul. "You can't leave me. We've been through so much together. You promised." He held up his hand as if to stop her, and her heart sank even harder. He looked at her in a way he had never looked at her before. It was like a goodbye, and she couldn't understand what was happening. She kept trying to find one word in his eyes, one feeling that would explain why he was willing to leave her. "Emily." His voice was soft now, but harder than ever. "You have to survive. It's the only way." The words he spoke cut into her soul. He spoke as if it wasn't just a decision, but something inevitable that couldn't be changed. He was certain, and that bothered her even more. Why hadn't he spoken to her like this before? Why couldn't she help him? Why did his fears and doubts cling to him like a shadow she couldn't dispel? You can't just pick up and leave, Adam. We've been there for each other forever, no matter how hard it gets. This isn't over." Her voice trembled more and more, and she could feel her inner world crumbling. He gritted his teeth and took a step back. He was determined, and she knew she couldn't convince him. He was willing to part with himself so that she would be saved, and in that was his sacrifice, too great for her to fully realize. It's the only chance. His eyes met hers again, and he noticed her gaze change. She understood everything, but she couldn't accept it. Her soul was torn. She didn't know how to proceed. How could she go on knowing that the one she loved was willing to go to his death so she could live? How could she live without him, when everything in her life was tied to him? "I can't lose you." Her voice was full of desperation. "We have to be together, Adam." But he only shook his head, as if her words couldn't sway his decision. Emily understood. It was his decision. This wasn't just a goodbye. It was a demand that came from the very heart, from the place where his love was stored. And it was painful. It hurt so much that even the air around him felt cold and foreign. He took a step to the side, and all Emily had left to do was watch his figure disappear into the mist. She was left standing as if the world around her had stopped. Every step she took now seemed unnecessary, and she knew that despite all her desire, she couldn't stop him. It wasn't her decision. "You will live, Emily, I promise." His words echoed in her head as she remained standing there, unable to move. He disappeared into the forest's misty distance, and she was left alone. The fog thickened around her, and with each step, Emily felt her heart break. He was her light, and now that light was consuming this fog. She clutched his last item in her hands, the very chain he'd worn all along. It was her only trace, her only link to him. Emily stood in the woods, clutching the chain in her hands, her eyes full of tears. The fog now hid everything that had once seemed familiar and safe. Everything around her had changed, and she could feel her world shrinking. Every step she took her further away from the time they had been together, when every moment had been full of hope. Now that hope was elusive, slipping away like the light they shared. She sighed, holding back tears. She couldn't allow herself to be weak. He'd said she had to live, that her life was his sacrifice, and now she must continue. But how can you go on when your soul is in pieces? How can you go on knowing you've left the most important thing in your world behind? Emily took a step forward, but her legs felt heavy, as if the forest itself was trying to stop her. He wasn't just a forest, he was a symbol of what she had lost. The whole place seemed empty and cold now, despite the warm light that had once been in her life. She couldn't find a way out, but she moved. She had to move because it was her path. The significance of his sacrifice wasn't lost on her, but he wasn't there for her, and her heart continued to clench in pain. He told her she had to live, and she kept going. But for what? To become an empty shell that carried her life forward but couldn't believe she was saved. All that resounded in her mind were his words, "You will live, I promise." It was his last request, and she couldn't ignore it. The fog seemed to grow even thicker. Every movement she made was slowing down, but she couldn't stop. It was a moment when she realized that life itself required her to walk, despite the weight of her losses. Despite her inner pain, she walked, seeing nothing in front of her but the thick fog that enveloped her body like an unknowable shadow. Each step she took became more and more heavy. Emily could feel the ground beneath her feet becoming viscous, as if she were drowning in this forest. The fog, preventing her from finding her way out, seemed to be squeezing her from all sides. But despite the fear and pain, she kept moving. With every step, with every effort, her thoughts returned to Adam. She couldn't understand how it was possible to walk without him. No matter how far she walked, his image stayed with her, like an unbearable pain, like an emptiness in her soul. The fog seemed to soak into her, engulf her thoughts, obscure her memory, but at the same time was a reminder of him, his face, his gaze, his words. "You must live, Emily." Those words echoed in her head, and she couldn't get rid of them. But she couldn't forget him, just as she couldn't forget what he'd done for her. Emily kept going, even though her strength was waning. She didn't notice time passing. The fog, hiding all landmarks, seemed endless. She didn't know how many hours had passed, but it didn't matter. She couldn't go back, and worst of all, she didn't know what to do. What would happen to her without him? How would she live if every moment of her life was tied to his presence? She lifted her head, and her gaze rested again on something familiar, an old tree covered in moss. Emily stopped, feeling her heart clench. It was the tree under which they had once stood, discussing their dreams and fears, where they had exchanged their last words of love before going their separate ways. Now that tree was her only reference point, the only sign that she wasn't completely lost. She approached the tree, touching its bark as if trying to feel something that connected her to the time they had been together. This moment was as relentless as everything else going on around her. She could feel her strength melting away as her body began to give up. But despite her physical fatigue, she couldn't stop. She couldn't let herself forget him because her life was tied to his sacrifice. He had said she had to live, and that was what kept her going. Emily took a step forward, feeling her body trying to resist with each movement. She could feel the fog getting thicker and thicker as it engulfed her completely. But she couldn't allow herself to stop. That would be tantamount to surrender, tantamount to oblivion. And Adam didn't want that. He'd left her here, with this duty, this promise, and she had to fulfill it. Her steps became more and more confident. She stopped looking around, not trying to find his footprints, not trying to figure out what had happened to him. He was her light, and she couldn't afford to waste time with doubt. She had to move on. That was the way it had been decided. As Emily continued on her way, she realized that life itself was now her test. The fog thickened more and more, and everything around her began to look like an empty, lifeless wasteland. But something in her soul, despite the pain, gave her the strength to move. Each step of her feet grew heavier and heavier, but her spirit would not give up. She had to go because it was the only way she could justify his sacrifice, the only way she could keep his memory alive. She thought about how much he had done for her, how he had been there for her when she needed him most. He had been her light, her support. And now that he wasn't there, her world was empty. But his words, his promise, she must live, kept her hands down. Suddenly, her gaze stopped on a small stream she hadn't noticed before. The water was rushing forward like a living thing, as if it was finding its way despite the obstacles. Emily approached the water, and her gaze lingered on the flowing stream. The water was so clear, so refreshing, but all she saw in its reflection was her own face, tired but determined. In that moment, she realized that she was still alive, and that was the most important thing. Emily felt his presence again, as if he were there. It wasn't a real sensation, but her heart beat confidently, knowing she had to continue. She couldn't allow herself to give up. Adam was beside her in her memory, in her soul, and this path she must now take was the only way to justify his sacrifice. She raised her head, looking around, but the fog still obscured everything around her. Every movement she made, every step she took in this forest now seemed part of her journey, part of her struggle. And despite the loneliness she felt, she knew she was not alone. He was with her, in her heart. Emily took another step, then another, and that step was more and more confident. She moved forward, not stopping, not allowing herself to break. She had to walk this path, and maybe one day it would lead her to him, to the one who had sacrificed his life to save her. The fog remained their constant companion. It wrapped around her like an invisible web, preventing her from walking easily, preventing her from breathing fully. Emily walked on, never looking back, but the pain still burned in her heart. She couldn't forget Adam, and despite her best efforts, his image never left her. Every word he said, every look he gave her continued to live in her soul like a fire that could not be extinguished. The forest seemed no longer just a place where they walked. It had become a living thing, where every rustle of wind, every moving bush was a warning. Emily could feel it, the tension, that lurking threat. It was as if, at this moment, everything around her was not just watching, but watching her with hostility, as if the forest itself resisted her presence. Her footsteps grew quieter. She seemed to be listening to every sound in this deaf forest. A shadow flickered behind the trees, making her heart clench. She stopped and looked around, but all she could make out in the misty distance was only the darkness that hid the unknown. She felt her chest constrict with anxiety. Something was wrong. But what? The forest hadn't been like this before. She and Adam had always felt safe here before, and now that she was alone, everything had changed. The nature that had once been her friend had become her enemy, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling. Suddenly, amidst the silence, she heard the creaking of branches. It wasn't just the sound of the wind, it was a sound that came from something large that was moving among the trees. At first she thought it was just her imagination, but then she heard the sound again and her heart skipped a beat. Something was coming after her. Someone or something. Emily turned sharply, peering into the fog. But nothing was visible, only shadows dissolving into a cloud of gloom and sounds that grew louder and closer. What was that? Her thoughts were racing, trying to find an explanation, but fear was already beginning to stir in her soul. This whole forest, this whole place seemed alive now, full of dangers she couldn't see. She took a step back but barely touched the ground as she heard that sound again. Footsteps. No, they weren't human footsteps. It was the sound of heavy, unnatural footsteps. Emily realized intuitively that she wasn't alone in this forest, and she couldn't figure out what exactly it was that was following her. At that moment, she noticed the sky had changed. The faint light that had illuminated the forest before was now gone. Everything around her became darker, as if the world itself was consuming her, cutting her off from everything. She clenched her teeth and took a step forward, hoping it was just her imagination, but her body didn't obey her. Every step she took was now filled with anxiety, and the further she walked, the clearer she felt the danger that was looming. She couldn't believe she was in this situation again. She was alone, without Adam, without his protection, and now her life depended on herself. But what was in this forest, what lurked in the fog, and what was getting closer with each step? She could not answer these questions, but she knew one thing. Her heart was no longer her own. It was gripped by fear. The fear was becoming more real with each passing moment, and Emily realized it wasn't just an obsession. Something was coming for her, and her intuition told her it was something dangerous. The fog thickened around her, and she felt her body tense up, ready for any threat. She looked around, and for a moment she thought she saw a shadow flicker in the fog, a huge, inhuman shadow. Her thoughts became confused, and she increased her steps sharply, trying to stay away from that incomprehensible but palpable fear. She tried not to think about what might be behind that sound, behind that shadow, but she couldn't shut off her mind from the anxiety that everything around her was against her. The forest had become her enemy, and the fog was her castle that clutched her on all sides. She could feel her steps becoming heavier, her breathing hitching. Suddenly, she heard another step. Not an ordinary one. It was sharp, fast, as if someone was gaining on her with great force. Emily froze. The same sound of footsteps she had heard before was now right behind her. She turned and saw a shadow that literally flashed through the fog. It was something big, something that moved like a beast, and it was moving right towards her. Emily's heart froze. She could only listen as her breathing became more and more intermittent. She tried to back away, but the shadow became more and more apparent. She saw the outline of something gigantic, majestic and intimidating lurking in that fog. It felt as if this shadow was becoming more real with each step, as if it were coming out of the depths of the forest, out of the darkest corners of it. Emily felt her strength begin to fade as her legs lost stability. She knew she couldn't move fast enough. She had to act, but what to do? What was that creature in the woods? With each step, her brain refused to understand what was happening. There were no thoughts in her head except one. How could she survive? She couldn't see what it was, but her intuition told her it wasn't all just a game. There was a threat lurking in that shadow, and she couldn't stay in this forest any longer. But as she took a step back, something pushed her away. Emily realized that there was more than just a threat behind her. Something bigger, something dangerous had been following her from the beginning. The shadow in the fog moved with terrifying speed, and Emily could no longer pretend to ignore the danger. Her breath caught in her chest, her heart pounded like a hammer, and every rustle in the forest sounded like a threat. Something unnatural was approaching. She was sure it wasn't just a beast, not just any animal she might have expected. It was something else, bigger, scarier. She stood still, not knowing where to go. There was no path in the forest, and the fog swallowed up every landmark, as if the world itself was disappearing around her. She clutched the knife she had brought with her, its cold blade the only solace in this terror. But she knew that neither weapon nor strength would help her if this creature decided to act. The shadow drew closer. Suddenly, Emily noticed how the forest around her became quieter, as if all the sounds of nature had fallen silent, and her presence in this place was unwelcome. With each step, the fog grew denser, and her heart clenched with foreboding. She couldn't believe that her life was in such danger again, but she realized that her only chance now was to react. She took a step back, and her feet were suddenly on something slippery, as if the ground itself beneath her feet had decided to betray her. She barely managed to steady herself, and at that moment the shadow took another step. It was right behind her. It wasn't just a threat, it was something that was following her, that was closing in on her with every move she made. Emily turned around sharply, a glint of determination in her eyes, and only one feeling pounding in her chest: to survive. She ran as fast as she could, despite the slippery ground and the fact that her strength was running out. The shadow pursued her, giving her no chance of escape, and she could feel the ground clutching her, becoming more and more hostile. Tears flooded her eyes, but she kept running. The fog, growing thicker and thicker, seemed to be trying to swallow her up, but there was something in her soul that kept her moving. She thought about the fact that Adam wouldn't want her to give up. His words, "You have to live," were her last chance, her only chance of survival. She had to move on. She couldn't allow herself to give up, to run without stopping. It was the only way out. Emily looked around more and more, feeling her breathing becoming more ragged and her legs losing strength. The shadow kept up. She didn't know what the creature was, but it was close. She could feel its eyes watching her every move. Suddenly, a sound like a sigh came from the mist. It was a deep, heavy sound, as if the earth itself was sighing with heaviness. Emily couldn't keep from shivering, her body stiffening with fear. She ran faster. Her legs felt heavy and her breath was hammering in her chest, but she couldn't stop. Suddenly she stumbled and nearly fell, but miraculously kept her balance and kept moving. The shadow was almost there. She heard footsteps, heavy and invisible, and it became clearer every moment that something huge was following her. Her teeth clenched, her breathing ragged. She was running, but she could not escape that pursuing shadow. The forest seemed very different now. The fog wasn't just atmosphere, it was her enemy, constricting space, offering no hope. She couldn't find a way out. Every movement she made became more and more desperate. She felt her strength draining, that she could no longer run as fast as she needed to. The shadow had retreated, or had she not noticed it? Emily felt a strange silence that enveloped her. There were no footsteps, no sounds, just a fog hiding everything from her view. She stopped, breathing heavily, and turned around. There was nothing to be seen. It was as if the world around her had frozen, but she knew the danger hadn't gone away. It was somewhere nearby and she couldn't calm down. Emily crouched down on a tree root, trying to catch her breath. Her legs were shaking with fatigue, her arms were scratched, and the blood on her skin felt like evidence of everything she'd been through. She tried to focus, to find the strength to move on, but the fear wouldn't let her go. She felt like her life depended on this moment, and she couldn't allow herself to give up. As if in response to her thought, a sound came out of the fog again. It was close at hand. Fear squeezed her chest, and she jumped up as she realized the creature was approaching again. The fog grew denser and denser, engulfing the world around them. It seemed that even the stars that had once been so bright were now hidden behind this fog. Emily kept moving forward, but her steps became more and more uncertain, each breath coming with difficulty. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, that she was not alone in the forest. The wind was getting stronger, whistling through the branches of the trees, louder and louder, as if nature itself was trying to insist on its right, making her afraid of every sound, every movement. Her heart hammered in her chest like a drum, driving her to action, to a decision. With each step, her breathing grew heavier and her legs grew more tired. But she could not stop. The shadow that haunted her in the woods kept her still. She knew that she couldn't stay here, that she had to find a way out. But what if there is no way out? What if everything around her is a trap that pulls her into the fog and won't let go? Her gaze darted sideways again, and she felt her heart sink. Behind her, in the very center of the fog, a figure flickered. She couldn't tell for sure if it was a man or something else, but its silhouette was too clear, too huge. The shadow was moving again. No, it couldn't be a man. It was something more than that. Emily clenched her teeth and quickened her step. But what was behind that shadow? Why was her heart clenching so hard that every movement seemed wrong? She couldn't figure out what was going on. But she knew one thing. She needed to move. She tried not to look back, trying to find the strength to move forward. Every sound now seemed strange and foreign to her. Branches snapped. Leaves were blown away by the wind, but it all seemed to her to be part of something more terrifying. Unable to bear it any longer, Emily suddenly stopped and looked around. The shadow was gone. No footsteps could be heard. No movement could be seen. But that didn't mean the threat was gone. On the contrary, everything she sensed said that she was getting closer and closer to some unknown danger that would not allow her to pass any further without consequences. She stood, clutching the knife in her hands. Combat? Defense? But from what? From whatever lurked in the fog, or from herself? The anticipation, the feeling that she was being seen, that she was being watched, was so real that she felt it on instinct. And then, as if confirming her fears, a figure emerged from the fog again. It had appeared as if out of nowhere, and its presence was so sudden and frightening that Emily barely had time to take a step back, holding her breath. There was nothing human in his eyes, only coldness, like a beast waiting for the moment. It was a creature she couldn't understand, couldn't describe. Her heart clenched. It wasn't a human being. It wasn't even an animal. Emily felt herself losing the ability to think, her mind shutting down and her instincts lashing out. The creature in front of her took a step forward, and the movement was so swift and sure that Emily didn't even have time to notice it move from the fog into a clearer part of the forest. She froze, her breathing barely audible, but her heart was pounding frantically, giving all of its power to this moment. She didn't know what she should do. She could only watch as this form grew closer and closer. The creature was unlike anything she had ever seen before. It was almost human, but not quite. Its eyes were black as coal, and as she looked into them, she felt a chill creep into her soul. Her hands clenched around the knife, but she knew that the weapon was powerless against this creature. What could she do against something that was unknowable and unknowable? The creature stepped closer to her, its footsteps soft, almost inaudible, but they evoked a sense of imminent threat within her. It looked at her, but did not speak a word. There was something in its gaze that made her shiver. Emily took a step back, but there was only a wall of darkness and fog in front of her. She couldn't run away. She couldn't hide. The moment the creature was very close, she felt something reaching for her, as if the air itself was becoming a part of the creature. The fog was thickening, but it was no defense for her. On the contrary, it only narrowed her space, limited her actions. The creature took another step, and now it was right in front of her. Her body clenched with fear, and she could no longer hide her panic. What is it? This question wouldn't leave her. She could only stare at the creature, feel its presence, and realize that her life depended on what happened next. And so it reached out its hand, not immediately, not abruptly, but as if it was waiting for her to take the first step. At first, Emily couldn't understand what it was doing, but her intuition told her it wasn't just a gesture, it was an invitation. Perhaps she had to take a step toward it to find out what awaited her beyond this fog. She took a step forward, and in that moment, the creature reflected something strange in his dark eyes. It wasn't evil. It was something else. It was something that seemed incomprehension and genuine anticipation of her actions. Emily froze. Her heart almost stopped beating. She couldn't believe she could do something like that. But she stood before him, ready for the consequences. Emily couldn't understand what was happening. Her entire body was tense, every muscle clenched like a taut string. The creature stood before her, its huge eyes dark and infinitely deep, never leaving her face. It was like an eclipse, like darkness itself penetrating her soul. She couldn't read his intentions, couldn't understand what he wanted from her. There was no rage in his gaze, no malice, just a cold, lifeless emptiness. The fog around them grew even thicker. It seemed to shrink, almost without air, as if the forest itself spoke to the creature. Everything around them seemed to freeze. She stood there, not knowing what to do, her thoughts darting around for a way out. The creature didn't move. It just stood there staring at her, and her fear became more and more apparent. But still, she couldn't look away. Afraid to take a sudden step or move, she was like trapped, caught in the gaze of this monster. Time stretched on endlessly. She could feel her body weakening, her strength draining away. But she couldn't let herself give up. She couldn't believe this was all happening to her. It was ridiculous. She had to leave. She had to survive. And as strange as it sounded, a thought flashed through her mind. Maybe she should have understood this creature, been prepared for its gestures. The creature took another step. Now it was right in front of her, its body not clearly defined, as if it were dissolving into mist, but still physical, tangible. The creature raised one arm and his fingers lightly touched her shoulder. That moment, when its cold fingers touched her skin, was the end of her struggle with herself. In that moment, she realized she couldn't run away. This wasn't just evil, it was more than that. What did it want from her? The answer didn't come, but Emily felt her heart stop. This creature, for all its strangeness and terror, was more than just an enemy. It was something important that had crossed her path. But for what purpose? Why was she here, in this forest, alone with this creature? And how could she go on if her life depended on this moment? Suddenly, the creature retreated. It didn't disappear, but it seemed to give her space, as if it was waiting for something from her. Emily froze, not believing her eyes, not knowing what to do. But her intuition said she must act. Her body was still struggling. She couldn't move forward or backward, and her heart was pounding so hard she thought it would come out of her chest. "Why?" she said, barely audibly, not realizing what she was asking. The creature didn't answer, but her question hung in the air, and that silence began to fill everything around her. The mist, the forest, and the creature itself became part of her sense of despair. The silence they were both in became more and more pressurized. Emily didn't know what was happening, but she could feel her heart beating faster and faster with each passing moment. The creature stood before her, unmoving, its eyes impenetrable, and Emily couldn't understand what it wanted from her. Time dragged on, but she realized it wasn't just fear, it was something more. The creature made no movement, but it was as if it sensed her, something that connected them on some unfathomable level. Her thoughts began to jumble. Maybe she should have realized that this creature wasn't an enemy, just something that was here for some reason. The only question swirling around in her mind was what now? The creature still hadn't moved. It remained in place, and although she could sense its presence, she couldn't understand its intentions. It was like a test. Her whole body screamed fear, but her mind seemed to be trying to find an answer. Emily couldn't believe that her life was facing this moment. She stood in the woods, surrounded by fog, facing a creature that was neither friend nor foe. She couldn't continue on her journey until she realized what this creature here meant, and her thoughts returned to Adam. He had told her that she must live. But why? Why did she have to go through all this? Emily clutched the knife sharply in her hands as if it was her last chance to save herself, but she could feel her inner world losing strength as the fog engulfing her began to pull her into some other state. She realized that even if she used that knife, it wouldn't save her. Her life was no longer in her hands. The creature knew that. Suddenly, the creature raised its hand and pointed at her. Emily froze. It wasn't doing this to threaten her, but to show her something. The moment her gaze met his, she felt more than just fear. It was understanding. Something important she had to learn. Something important she was about to realize. She clutched the knife, ready for any move. The creature didn't move. It waited. And maybe at this point, all she had to do was just go through with it. She took a step forward. Emily walked without feeling the minutes pass, her steps changing and her breathing becoming heavier. The fog that had enveloped her from the beginning was now a part of her very existence. It wasn't just around her, it was inside her. Its dampness penetrated her skin, its coldness restrained her movements. Her entire life for this moment merged with this gray space, as if she had lost all connection to reality. All the sounds of the forest, this whole world now became non-existent, except for this endless cloud around which she was circling. She couldn't shake the feeling that something much more than a shadow was following her. All her instincts told her that it was the fog that was her enemy. It was a trap that was sneaking up on her, giving her false hopes, only to eventually swallow her whole. But what awaited her if she dared to continue? The questions in her head sounded like hammers, causing her to become lost in her thoughts.